Let me just start with a quick story. I love practical jokes. I don't know about you. That doesn't mean that I like playing practical jokes on people. I'm not actually very good at that. I don't really like it when people play practical jokes on me, but I love practical jokes as a sort of source of stories because it's such a good sort of discussion point. It's one of those in the LessonStream membership in the story course, we refer to them as contagious stories. Everybody's got a story about a practical joke that they witnessed, a practical joke that they played on somebody, maybe as a child, or a practical joke that somebody played on them. I know I've got a few of my own. And every practical joke ever played is a potential story. And I was working through, or I was reading a Wikipedia entry for practical jokes. Just, I don't know, I sometimes go off on Wikipedia rabbit holes. Do you ever do that? And it still does, it has a section marked famous examples. And one of the examples that it cites is about this character. He was an American bohemian artist from last century called Waldo Pierce. I'd never heard of him myself, but the story goes like this. Waldo Pierce moved to Paris and he made friends with this woman who lived in the same apartment as him. And I'm reading between the lines here. I think that because they became such good friends, she trusted him and she gave him the spare key to her apartment. You know, we all like to leave a spare key with a neighbor, don't we? So that's what she did. Now it's time for Waldo Pierce to play a practical joke because Waldo Pierce decided to give her a gift. This woman, she loved animals, and so he gave her the gift of a tiny little tortoise. He must have bought it in a Parisian pet shop, a tiny little tortoise. And she was delighted with this gift. And then Waldo Pierce started to let himself into her apartment when she was not there. Quite naughty, very naughty. And he would replace this tortoise with a slightly larger one, you see. And he'd do this every few days or every few weeks until this tortoise was starting to exhibit miracle growth. And this woman could not believe what was going on. This pet tortoise, which was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, this was the biggest tortoise in Paris. And it had grown so big so quickly. And the woman was actually delighted. And she would show it to anybody who was interested and tell them the story of her miracle growing tortoise. And when it was as big as it could be, I guess Waldo Pierce couldn't find any bigger tortoises in the Parisian pet shops. He reversed the process and replaced it with slightly smaller ones. And so instead of the miracle growth that it previously exhibited, it started to become the incredible shrinking tortoise. And the woman wasn't quite as happy as she was. She was very worried about this tortoise. Now, I don't know what you think of this practical joke. I'm very skeptical of it. I think that the truth probably isn't quite what was reported, but I do love it as a story. And it's a question that I would ask my students if I was going to share this story with them. Let me just show you here that this is the story as it's reported, as I mentioned, in Wikipedia, in the entry for practical jokes, the famous example, one practical joke by the American painter and bohemian character Waldo Pierce while living in Paris in the 20s. And they talk about turtles. I talk about tortoises. I think Americans don't differentiate between turtles and tortoises. For me, a turtle is one that lives in the sea. A tortoise is one that lives in the land. But I think in international context, it's much more common to talk about turtles. But what's so interesting here, you can see that I really like this story, and so did Roald Dahl, because Roald Dahl used this story for the inspiration for his book, Esio Trot. And I wonder, is there anybody here who knows why this book is called Esio Trot? I didn't know. until I read it. But I've always been a big fan of Roald Dahl's. I grew up in his stories. And so I decided that I had to order this book on Amazon. I didn't even know it existed. And interestingly, Esio Trot is the very last book that Roald Dahl wrote in his lifetime. So I ordered it on Amazon, and I was really looking forward to getting it. I actually couldn't wait, because in my mind I was thinking, okay, I know about the practical joke that this guy played on this woman in Paris in the 1920s, and I know that Roald Dahl took inspiration from it for this story, Esio Trot. But how exactly does the story work? Um, and and I really wanted to know. And I got the book. Here it is, right here. And I couldn't wait to find out, who are the characters. Where do they live? What's the relationship between them? And maybe most importantly, why does one of the characters want the other one to think that their pet tortoise, or turtle if you prefer, is growing or shrinking? Is it another practical joke? And if it's not a practical joke, then what is it? What's the motivation behind this potentially nefarious act? And so I really wanted to know this. And I got the book and I read it in one sitting. And then I thought, okay, that was quite good. It was quite interesting. But because I'd been primed to think all of these thoughts, to ask all of these questions, I think I was in quite a good position to take a more sort of critical stance when I read it. And what I really wanted to know was, how have other people reacted to this story? So I went on to Amazon and read all the reviews. I read as many different posts about this book as I could read, and it was a really interesting little sort of exercise. And so what I then did is I designed an activity for students, which is in the resources section in the LessonStream membership. It's a very simple one, really. Let me show you what it looks like. It looks like this. You give students the story. You tell students about the story of the practical joke, that is, the one that I told you, the one that I got from Wikipedia, the one that involves this naughty, naughty man called Waldo Pierce. So students are actually given the story. You as the teacher, you tell them the story as I told it to you, but that's there waiting for them as well in a more kind of prepared text form. So if they didn't understand the story when it came from their teacher, they've got a second attempt when you give it to them on text. And then you see what's so good about this is Roald Dahl only based the storyline on that practical joke. He was inspired by it, but he didn't use it, or he wasn't a slave to the events of it. You see, he played with it. And so you put your students into the shoes of a writer. And what they're doing here is they're not writing a story. This is very important. They're not actually creating a story. They are designing a storyline. And there's a difference here. So you put students into groups and you give them the task. You've got to use this practical joke for the basis of a storyline that you are creating for children. It might be a children's film, it might be a children's book. It doesn't matter. But the task is all there. They've got to think about who the people are, who are the characters in this story, where does the story take place? Most importantly, why does one of the characters want the other character to think that their tortoise, if it is a pet tortoise, is displaying miraculous growth or miraculous shrinkage? What is the motivation behind that? In this book, it's not actually a practical joke. What are the challenges that the character faces in order to do this? And what happens as a result? How does this story end? This works really well for teenagers and for adults. And finally, once they've shared their storylines, shared their work with each other, you can then direct them to Wikipedia, where they can read a synopsis of this book for themselves. Or if they prefer, they can buy the book online. Or if you've got some kind of reading club in your school, and you can maybe try and order this book, because it is actually slightly controversial, the story. Does it, we often assume that children's stories are going to instill values. Roald Dahl doesn't always do that. And that allows us to really talk about this and become more critical of the book. Students, as I mentioned, are more primed to be more critical of the book than they would have been had they just found it and picked it up and read it for themselves.